Before we get started, I want to take just a moment to tell you what this is. This is the Tennessee History Nerd, where we tell the stories of the volunteer state, one place, one event, and one narrative at a time. If you enjoy place-based history, stories tied to real locations you can visit, be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and X, where we release short-form videos from these same sites throughout the week. Now, let's get into the story. The term Sweet 16 brings to mind something special. For example, it marks the rite of passage from dependence to independence, that moment when many teenagers finally hold the keys to a car and get a job and begin to experience a wider world. Sports fans also know about the Sweet 16. It's that threshold where contenders in the NCAA basketball tournament separate themselves from the crowd. And Chuck Berry sang about Sweet Little 16. It's a term that hums with momentum, the sound of someone or something coming into its own. And for Tennesseans, 16 means something even more enduring because it marks the moment our frontier became family, the day that Tennessee joined the Union as the 16th star in the American constellation, and that makes us the Sweet 16. But before there was a Tennessee, there was a land in between, mountains to the east, a river to the west, and an awful lot of unclaimed promise in between. Picture one of those old hand-drawn maps. The edges browned, rivers meandering like veins, labels written by men who often had never even seen what they were naming. Here you'd find Cherokee towns with names that still musically roll off the tongue. Chota, Tanasi, Tellico, Tuskegee. You'd find Chickasaw hunting grounds stretching toward the Mississippi. Along the Watauga and Holston rivers, you'd see rough cabins and small blockhouses where settlers from Virginia and the Carolinas came in and took root. Each stroke of the surveyor's pen, each crossing of a mountain pass, carried the same dream to turn wilderness into belonging. And before it was the 16th state, Tennessee was a patchwork of people, native, European, African, and of experiments in self-rule. It's the story of how they all learned to live together long enough to draw a border around themselves and call it home. Of course, the original 13 colonies claimed the first seats in the new nation through winning their independence from England. Then, in 1791, Vermont stepped forward as the 14th state, followed closely by number 15, Kentucky, in 1792. By 1796, Tennessee would take its place as number 16, a younger sibling to those founding sisters, but every bit as determined to have a say in the nation's family business. The road from wilderness to statehood began with a simple but seismic act. North Carolina gave us away. In 1789, North Carolina ceded its western lands, the whole span beyond the Appalachian crest, to the federal government. Congress organized it as the territory south of the River Ohio, though folks quickly took to calling it the Southwest Territory. President George Washington appointed William Blount as its governor in 1790, and Blount set up shop in Knoxville. For 6 years, the territory functioned as a kind of nation in training. It had a capital, courts, and militia, and it attracted settlers by the thousands. The ink on the U.S. Constitution was barely dry, and already the new republic was learning how to fold frontier voices into its chorus. But self-government wasn't new to these hills. As early as the 1770s, settlers on the Watauga River drafted their own compact, the Watauga Association, to keep order and trade fairly with the Cherokee. It wasn't recognized by any crown or colony, but it worked. It was a social contract hammered out between neighbors. A decade later, those same instincts drove another experiment. Frustrated with North Carolina's distant rule and slow aid, and then the cession of western lands to the United States to pay revolutionary debts, over the mountain settlers declared themselves the State of Franklin in 1784, electing John Sevier as governor. They set up courts, levied taxes, and petitioned Congress for admission. Franklin never gained official recognition, and it fizzled after a few chaotic years, but it left behind an unmistakable message. These settlers weren't waiting for permission to govern themselves. Now, we'll talk more about the state of Franklin in a few weeks with a dedicated episode. But when Blount's territorial government arrived, it didn't have to teach Tennesseans how to be citizens. They already were. By 1795, census takers tallied more than 77,000 free inhabitants, enough to qualify for statehood under the Northwest Ordinance formula. In January 1796, delegates from each county gathered in Knoxville to draft a constitution. There were 55 of them, 5 per county, a balance of farmers, lawyers, and soldiers, all meeting in what was, at that time, still frontier country. Blount presided, Sevier hovered in the background, and in less than 6 weeks, they produced a remarkably polished constitution, 2 legislative houses, an executive governor, an independent judiciary, and a Bill of Rights echoing both North Carolina's and the new federal model. When Congress received their petition, Tennessee already looked like a functioning state, and so on June 1st, 1796, Congress made it official. Tennessee was admitted as the 16th state of the Union. A frontier had become a partner. A rough sketch had become part of the portrait. But a name and a constitution are only half of what makes a state a state. The other half is geography, the shape, where you begin, where you end, and what lies in between. Tennessee's contours would come to define its culture as much as the Constitution. 3 grand divisions, east, middle, and west. All of these are stitched together by rivers and ridges, symbolized today by the 3 stars on our flag. When you look at Tennessee on a map, you see order, straight lines running east and west on the northern and southern borders, and more or less parallels for the eastern and western borders. But if you've ever been to Tennessee, really been here, then you know that's a polite illusion. The land folds and twists like an old quilt rumpled on an unmade bed. Mountains rise and fall. Rivers loop and double back. And the soil changes underfoot every few miles. That topography, the way that the land moves, wasn't just a backdrop for the state's history. It was one of its co-authors. From the start, geography shaped Tennessee's identity into 3 great divisions, east, middle, and west, what we still call the Grand Divisions. You'll even find them symbolized on our flag, 3 white stars within a blue circle, united but distinct. Those stars don't just mark regions. They mark the rhythm of how Tennesseans have always lived. Mountain people, basin farmers, and delta dwellers, each with their own voice and landscape. East Tennessee clings to the spine of the Appalachians, stretching from the North Carolina border westward to the Cumberland Plateau. Here, steep ridges carve narrow valleys, and rivers like the Holston, French Broad, and Little Tennessee snake toward Knoxville before merging into the mighty Tennessee River. It was here that the Overhill Cherokee once kept their towns, Chota, Tanasi, and others, and where the earliest Euro-American settlements like Watauga and Franklin took root. The terrain made life harder, but it also made people resilient. fiercely independent, and later in history, uniquely resistant to secession when the Civil War came calling. Middle Tennessee lies beyond the plateau, a broad, fertile basin carved by the Cumberland and Duck Rivers and stretches across the western path of the Tennessee River. This was the land of Revolutionary War grants, the reward for veterans who traded musket fire for plows. Nashville, with its gentle hills and navigable river, grew up here as a hub of trade and culture. Its soil and position made it the state's beating heart. West Tennessee begins at the meandering Tennessee River and stretches to the Mississippi, a place of hardwood forests, bottomland, and swampy low ground. It's generally flatter than the rest of the state, but what it lacks in elevation, it makes up for in richness. Soil that is so fertile that 19th century farmers called it black gold. Memphis would later rise from this ground as the gateway to the Mississippi Delta. 3 divisions, 1 state, each distinct but bound together by the rivers that run through them. And the largest of these meandering out of the state and then back in to divide the West from the middle, the river that shares its name with the state, the Tennessee. If you trace the word Tennessee back far enough, you won't find it on any English map. You'll find it in Cherokee, and possibly farther back even to the Uchis who preceded the Cherokee in the area. The name comes from Tanasi, a town that once stood along the Little Tennessee River in what's now Monroe County. In 1755, British officer Henry Timberlake's map recorded it that way. It's one of the first English renderings of a Cherokee word that already carried centuries of meaning. Now, there are conflicting stories about exactly what Tanasi means. Linguists have offered several possibilities: meeting place, bend in the river, winding water. Whatever the true meaning, it was born of geography, a word that described how land and water met. And when English speakers tried to pronounce it, it softened and stretched until Tanasi became Tennessee. So the name of the state itself carries a bit of the land's music. It's a Cherokee word adopted by settlers, pressed into legal parchment, and echoed across every map and milestone since. Every time we say Tennessee, we're speaking an old Cherokee name for a river town that's long gone beneath the waters of Tellico Lake, but whose sound still anchors us. Now, if the name came easily, the borders did not. The land that became Tennessee was originally part of North Carolina. In the late 1770s, when surveyors Thomas Walker and Daniel Smith were sent to mark the boundary between Virginia and North Carolina, they faced the same problem that plagued nearly every 18th century survey: compasses that drifted, maps that disagreed, and terrain that refused to cooperate. Their task, in theory, was simple: trace the 36-degree 30-minute parallel westward from the Appalachian crest. In practice, they strayed several miles south of the true latitude. But in 1779 and 1780, the land west of the Appalachians was still wilderness, and no one thought much of it. Virginia and North Carolina were just trying to set down who owned what in a part of the continent neither had fully explored. The line became known as the Walker Line, and it was an honest mistake that would ripple across 2 centuries. For the record, in spite of a lingering legend, overindulgence of homemade whiskey by the surveyors does not seem to have played any part in their error. When Kentucky broke off from Virginia in 1792 and Tennessee followed from North Carolina in 1796, that misplaced survey line suddenly mattered. The strip of land between the Walker Line and the true 36-degree 30-minute parallel became disputed ground. Settlers didn't know whether they were paying taxes to Frankfort or to Nashville, And for decades, both states issued overlapping land grants. Locals called the confused borderland the Walker Strip. Others nicknamed it jokingly Tennessee. The dispute finally ended with the Kentucky-Tennessee Compact of 1820, which gave the territory to Tennessee but allowed Kentucky to honor land titles already granted there. Even so, if you look at a modern map, you'll still see the legacy of that mistake. A small notch on Tennessee's northern border between Clarksville, Tennessee, and Murray, Kentucky. A scar of human error etched into geography. Later, in Virginia versus Tennessee in 1893, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that such compacts between states, like the one that settled the Walker Line, were legally binding without Congress's explicit approval, setting an important precedent for boundary law across the country. In other words, a misread compass in 1779 helped define not just where Tennessee ends, but how American states can agree where anything ends. While the northern line twisted through confusion, the eastern border came a little more naturally. The crest of the Appalachian Mountains, a watershed divide stretching from the Smokies down through the Unakas, formed a boundary that everyone could at least see. Yet even that wasn't simple. Surveyors debated which ridge counted as the true divide between North Carolina and what would become Tennessee. Should it follow the highest continuous crest, or trace the line where the rivers split their flow east and west? Over the years, minor adjustments were made, but the core idea held. The mountains themselves marked the edge. It was a border drawn by God's hand more than man's. And for all the arguments it spared, it also left behind a truth. Tennessee's earliest stories begin and end with those ridges. They're the wall that held the frontier in, and eventually the threshold that opened it to the west. By the mid-1790s, the land we now call Tennessee had borders taking shape on every side, except perhaps the most complicated ones, south and west. These weren't just lines on a map. They were living boundaries that changed with each step, each bend in the river, each treaty signed or ignored. If you'd like to support what we're doing here, we do have merchandise available through the Summers Media Enterprises website. It's a simple way to support the work and help us continue traveling, researching, and telling these stories. Plus, you get to pick up some cool swag that lets you show everybody what your new favorite podcast is. You can find that link in the show notes as well, and we appreciate your support. This may seem strange now, but when Tennessee became a state in 1796, its entire southern border touched Georgia, not Alabama and not Mississippi. Those states didn't exist yet, and neither did the Mississippi Territory that would precede them. At that time, all the lands directly to the south of Tennessee, stretching clear to the Gulf of Mexico, were still claimed by Georgia under its old colonial charter. For decades, Spain had asserted overlapping rights to the same vast region, maintaining forts along the Gulf Coast and influencing trade up the Mobile and Tombigbee rivers. But in 1795, the Treaty of San Lorenzo, also called Pinckney's Treaty, finally resolved that dispute. Spain recognized the 31st parallel as the southern boundary of the United States, the same line that today marks the Georgia-Florida border. And they withdrew their remaining territorial claims north of that latitude. Florida, however, remained a Spanish possession, a reminder that the southern edge of the young republic still met with the old world's frontier. Even after Spain's retreat, Georgia continued to claim all the land between Tennessee's 35th parallel and that Spanish U.S. territory, territory that included what are now Alabama and Mississippi. So when Tennessee joined the Union, its southern boundary wasn't with two future states or even with a federal territory. It was with Georgia alone, whose chartered claim technically extended westward to the Mississippi River and all the way south to the Gulf of Mexico. It wasn't until after the Yazoo land scandal, a messy episode of fraudulent land sales that embarrassed Georgia's legislature and infuriated the public, that the state finally ceded its western lands to the federal government in 1802. And only then did Congress organize these lands into the Mississippi Territory, which in time would be divided to form Mississippi in 1817 and Alabama in 1819. So, for the first 6 years of Tennessee's existence, its entire southern boundary lay across a single shared line of latitude, the 35th parallel north, belonging entirely to Georgia, framed by treaties, speculation, and a slowly stabilizing new nation. That line of latitude was meant to be clear and mathematical, but math rarely survives first contact with mountains. Surveyors marking the 35th parallel through the southern Appalachians found their compasses skewed by iron deposits and their chains snagged on ridges. The result was a line that wobbled just enough to cause headaches for generations. That misplaced survey is why Georgia's modern boundary sits nearly a mile south of where it should be, denying it direct access to the Tennessee River near Nickajack. To this day, Georgia occasionally revives its claim that a corrected survey would give it a small sliver of shoreline and a powerful water source for the Atlanta metro area. Tennessee's polite reply is always the same: the line stands as drawn. And if you've ever driven I-24 just west of Chattanooga, you've experienced the terrain that caused the confusion. For about 4 miles, the highway dips briefly into Georgia before curving back into Tennessee. That odd detour isn't a mistake. It's geography's reminder that sometimes the land decides before the law does. If the southern boundary was crooked because of mountains, the western boundary was crooked because of water. The Mississippi River was Tennessee's western edge from the beginning. It was a bold, simple declaration on paper that turned out to be anything but simple in practice, because rivers move. They shift their channels, they carve new bends, they abandon old ones. In the Mississippi Valley, those changes could be dramatic. Whole towns suddenly found themselves on the wrong side of the current after a single flood season. A good example of this is the site of a defining Civil War battle on the Mississippi, Island Number 10, which today is no longer an island but is now actually part of Missouri. Early on, Tennessee and Arkansas followed the so-called Fallweg rule. This is the principle that the state line follows the main navigable channel of a river, wherever that channel happens to be. It's the same reason that when you cross the Mississippi River Bridge from Memphis into West Memphis, Arkansas, the state line sits in the middle of the bridge, roughly above the middle of the waterway, not along either bank. The river channel itself is the border. Over time, the Mississippi's wandering created a few oddities. When the river cut new channels in the 1800s, small patches of Tennessee land ended up stranded on the Arkansas side of the current flow. The most famous examples are near Reelfoot Point and Island Number 35, where 19th century floods marooned Tennessee soil west of today's river. They're still legally Tennessee, though you have to cross into Arkansas to reach them. Even geography, it seems, enjoys a practical joke every now and then. So, by the time Tennessee's rivers were settled, or at least argued into submission, something more important had happened. The people inside those borders had learned to govern themselves. When those 55 delegates gathered in Knoxville in early 1796 to draft the state's first constitution, they weren't just drawing up a legal document. They were proving that frontier democracy could work. They borrowed the best of North Carolina's model and wove in the ideals of the new federal constitution: separation of powers, a bicameral legislature, an independent judiciary, and a declaration of rights. Most remarkable of all, they did it quickly. In just over 5 weeks, the delegates produced a polished constitution so effective that Congress admitted Tennessee directly under it without demanding revisions. It was the first Western state to join the Union under a home-written constitution already in force. That same constitution would be revised twice more, in 1834 and in 1870, but the DNA of Tennessee's self-government was already set. The people of the frontier had taken a wilderness, measured it, named it, and given it laws. So, if you go back to that old sepia-toned map, the one with the rivers like veins and the mountains like folded parchment, you can almost see the story forming. A frontier becomes a territory becomes a state, and a number, 16, marks the moment when the Union reached out and welcomed Tennessee into the family. Our lines aren't perfect. Our rivers don't stay still. Our borders were born from a mix of idealism and error, hard work and happenstance, ridges and rivers, parallels and meridians, and a reminder that sometimes nature demands that you follow her contours, her patterns, and her design. But that's exactly what makes them special and how they help to define us. Tennessee's name comes from the Cherokee. Its shape comes from the earth itself, and its spirit from the people who, when faced with uncertainty, simply said, "We've got this. We'll draw the lines ourselves." On June 1st, 1796, the ink dried and Tennessee became the 16th state, the Sweet 16. And the flag of the United States gained not just another star, but a story that still runs, like the rivers that formed it, from ridge to delta. So that about does it for this episode of the Tennessee History Nerd. If you're the kind who likes to know where the story came from, hang around after the episode ends, and I'll share a quick word of thanks to the museums, archives, and historians whose work makes what we're doing here at the Tennessee History Nerd possible. And I hope you'll join me for the next episode. We're going to ask the question, what's in a nickname? And look at Tennessee's most famous nickname. I hope you'll join us. Until then, I'm Big John Summers, the Tennessee History Nerd, and I am history. For this episode, I drew heavily from the TennesseeEncyclopedia.net, along with material from the Tennessee Blue Book and additional educational resources from Tennessee History for Kids. I've listed the main sources for this episode in the show notes. These stories are built on the work of historians, educators, and researchers who have helped to preserve them. Very grateful for that work and want to make sure that we acknowledge that. The Tennessee History Nerd is part of Summers Media Enterprises. In addition to the podcast, we produce short-form historical video content that you can find on our social media accounts on Facebook, Instagram, and X. And I'm also available on a limited basis for speaking engagements, presentations, and educational events. So if you're interested in having us to speak or collaborate with you, you can find more information through the links in the show notes. Thanks again for listening.